Hi, I'm Mary Sumala Folkerds, lead pastor at the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd here in Moorhead, Minnesota and Fargo, North Dakota. Thank you for joining us for our December edition of Leading the Conversation. The goal of these conversations has always been to engage a topic that is in our community and then to find the ways that we can be the kind of neighbors that Jesus has called us to be. And in this month of December, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to hear some stories that can touch our hearts, can help us to open up to one another, be empathetic, and to understand what people are going through right now. This week, to help us out with this, we have gifted storyteller and journalist Kevin Wallevand to share some of his wisdom and some of the stories that have impacted him over the years. Welcome, Kevin. Kevin Wallevand is an Emmy and Edward R. Murrow award-winning reporter and documentarian who has a reputation of telling compelling stories locally and also gathering them from around the world. And you are also a fellow MSUM alum.
Yep, go Red, Dragons. Go Dragons.
Well, as we get started, I would love to know some of your backstory. Well, how did you get to where you are today? What are some of those mile markers? And maybe what are some passions and values that have brought you to this place?
Well, I grew up in Otter Tail County in a little town of Vining, which is about 40 people. You know, honestly, that's where I think some of the, caring for your neighbor was really set in stone, was just that little country church, which, when I go back to the lake on weekends, every Saturday I make a drive out there. And, water flowers at the cemetery and all that good stuff. But also I'm just struck by, what an impact those years in that little country church. Today, it's a little depressing because there's probably, 12, 14 people there. And that's it.
Yeah.
And, of course, they're all relatives. But so you kind of wonder, what the future is for churches like that. But that kind of got the ball rolling on, and having family. They were mentors to me, and I watched them do, caring about mission work and caring about your neighbor. Even though a lot of us, growing up didn't have a lot, you still, cared for who was around you. And so that kind of got the ball rolling.
What propelled you to kind of take your upbringing and channel that into journalism? How did you choose that path?
Well, this is super nerdy, but I remember in the basement, we got one channel growing up, and it was out of Alexandria, so it was bad TV. But so that's all we could get was one channel. And I remember I had a cardboard box, and I would set it up, and I'd imitate David Brinkley, who was then the NBC news anchor.
Yeah.
And I'd pretend to read the news and pretend I was a news guy or whatever. And there was some reporters I would imitate. I remember like Garrick Utley, Irving R. Levine, all old NBC names or whatever. So I'd imitate them. So it must have been kind of a bug. But also my interest in just current events. Mm-hmm. I was just glued to like Vietnam War stuff, Northern Ireland. I remember all that being on the news a lot, and Watergate. I was at Luther Crest Bible Camp when Nixon resigned, and we all had to gather and watch this snowy black and white TV at Luther Crest when Nixon resigned. So yeah, some of that, I think, interest in current events really sparked maybe that route. Plus, I was horrible at math. I was horrible at pretty much everything else. So that kind of paved the way.
So there's something to be said about just having one channel, like being bored enough to have to just focus on one thing.
Well, plus no one had to get up and turn it, right? You got one channel, there was nothing to turn. But I guess we survived.
Yeah. I'm wondering, since you are known for being such a gifted storyteller in our community, what are your favorite kinds of stories to tell?
I guess I like the underdog type stories. I like the stories of someone having a message for other people, right? So I just got done this week telling the stories of life on a COVID unit.
Yep.
And, going on the COVID floor with these nurses and hearing patients tell their stories. Those were compelling because they all had a message. It's like, hey, we got to be smart, or we are going to, in the next few weeks, fill our hospitals to the point we don't have any room. And wearing a mask is smart, and all this stuff. So some of these stories, these people have messages. Not so much that we have a message, because we're the journalists, right? We're reporting what someone is saying.
Yeah.
So, I like stories like that. Stories of, kids, courageous kids. Like I remember a kid in Milner, North Dakota, Parker Siebens, lost both arms in a farm accident. So he was 3 years old at the time. And, recovered from that. And I remember going down to his family home in Milner and doing a story about him. So he was 3 at the time. And we continued to do stories like when he was in junior high, when he was about to graduate, and when he got married. So we have kind of followed this kid who, for a while, many thought he wouldn't even survive, to the point where, how can this, 3, 4-year-old carry on with no arms?
Yeah.
And then just kind of the lessons he taught through his, courage and perseverance type of stuff.
Well, and when you brought up your recent stories, those 3 stories on the COVID unit, what was so powerful to me is I recognized some of the people under the gear, and it made me appreciate them, because I was like, I've seen that person in church. I've seen that person at the grocery store, and they look like a regular person in their regular mask, but then they go to work and they put on all this stuff, and this is what they deal with every day. And it just helped me empathize with that person that I'd seen in one light, and now I got to see them in another way.
And the sacrifices they make, because they're parents. So their kids might be on a hybrid model, at home, trying to do school at home, and yet, mom and dad are working. Mom's on nurse hours where they're working more hours on a crazy schedule. And I'm a wimp. I went into a patient room yesterday and had to wear the N95 mask.
Yep.
And it was so hot, so tight. I thought, how can anyone wear this all day? It was suffocating.
Yep.
And they do it all the time.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for the viewer to, see some of that. And the response we got from viewers was pretty incredible, just from an educational standpoint. People thanking the nurses and others for telling their stories so that it can get out to others. So I think that's an important role of a journalist in your community, is to, tell the story.
And as you were telling the story about Parker Siebens, I was thinking about one of the questions I've had in the back of my mind is, what's it like to be embedded in a community, one community, for your whole career, and what are some of the gifts of that? And I think you just sharing about Parker Siebens, and one of the gifts would be you not just got to see him immediately after that accident,
right,
and see how he was adjusting, but you got to see him at other mile markers in his life. So what are some other gifts of being embedded in a place for a long time?
Well, from a selfish reporter standpoint, you can get a lot of good stories, right? Just because you're old and you've been there a while. So people tend to reach out and say, hey, have you thought about this? Or how about looking into this? And I just think you develop, if you've been in, it's just like any other job, I guess. If you've been in a place for a while, your tentacles go out. So, you kind of develop sources, and people will trust you after a while, and share stories. And that's the thing about this job. and this is a good story to talk about with what you just said. So I got a call this week after the COVID stories ran. I got a call from someone, and they said, did you know that a 30-year-old man died of COVID from Fargo? I'm like, no. And I didn't recognize the name, but I kind of called around, got some contacts, and found the father. So I reached out to the father, and I said, hey, sorry to hear about the loss of your son. Could you call me? Not thinking he would, because it was pretty early. But a couple hours later, he called, and he goes, we talked for about 10 minutes, and he's like, well, you know who he is. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I really don't. He goes, when our son was 3 months old, you were at our house and did a story, and you held him for like 20 minutes. It was some random story about the popularity of cotton diapers or something. I don't know.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, we shot a story with this couple and their baby.
Yeah.
And 30 years later, here he is, a victim of COVID. And, our plan is to do a story next week with them. So, yeah, I think that just shows, this is such a great community. People are willing to share their stories.
Yeah.
And you kind of become part of their life too, because they, at that moment, whether it's like the Parker Sebens, or I think of Emily Paulson from Moorhead, how we followed her through elementary and high school. Now she's a registered nurse. And Hannah Pappenfuss from Moorhead, how we followed her all this time. You almost become part of their family. So you get invited to their grad parties, you get invited to their weddings, because you were kind of part of that journey. So,
and even those stories that end in heartbreak, it's still powerful that you were able to share part of their story. And the family still has that. They still have those mile markers that you shared and helped them document, helped them tell their story. Because even when their hearts are broken, I think there's a healing element of being able to tell your story.
There is. And, I think of some of these military families that lost loved ones who were serving overseas, Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever. And, for them to share stories of their loved one on what that person meant to them, what they want people to know about them, that's very compelling. Now, not everyone wants to do that. I understand that. But, that's the one thing about this job is people are often sharing like some of the most intimate, emotional, trying moments in their life. Whether it's the loss of a child, maybe it's during COVID, maybe they just lost their job, maybe they lost their business. Maybe they're FaceTiming their dad at a COVID unit for the last time. So I think what a privilege that is to be able to, sit down with these people, ask them really, tough questions, and they're willing to share that story. I find that so amazing, especially around here, because, a lot of us are from that kind of stoic background, and actually it's like none of your business. And there is some of that, and I get it, because there's no way I do any of this. But I'm amazed at the families that are willing to step up and share a story from a cold phone call. You know what I mean?
But I think there's something about your approach, too, because somebody could be calling to hear about a story and they could do it from an exploitative type of, let's just have a splashy headline. But I think there's something about your person that as you enter into these situations or call someone up, it seems like you're doing it in a spirit of humility, in a spirit of wanting to honor them, not wanting to harm them in any way. So
and there's something to be said on the ask, on how you do approach a family. And you're right, that's important on how you lay it out. We get young reporters from across the country that work, they're here for a year or two, and
Yeah.
you can tell there's just a different approach if they're not, I hate to say it, if they're not from here, you know
Yep,
what I mean?
yep.
And they didn't spend a lot of time here.
Knowing the culture and the context. Yeah. Since it is the month of December and a lot of people won't be able to share Christmas with their loved ones as they'd want to, this is a time where I think it's important for us to come together and understand what other people are experiencing. And even if this wasn't a COVID December, I think Christmas is still often a stressful and emotional time for people. There's just a lot that people carry with them into Christmas. But if we can start to hear some stories of what some people are dealing with, I think it helps all of us be able to understand one another, have empathy for one another, and find creative ways to reach out to one another during this whole Christmas season. So I'm wondering if you would share some Christmas stories or stories of this season that are just really sticking with you or impacting you.
You know, one story that stuck with me, and it happened 37 years ago. And so it must have had an impact, right? Because that's a long time ago. But there was a little boy in Wahpeton. His name was Randy Link. And he was dying of cancer. And at the time, here in Fargo-Moorhead, there just wasn't a lot of treatment for pediatric cancer. So he was down at the U of M. So his second grade classmates, there was no cell phones. So they had a phone on the wall in the room, and they would call him every day. And as Christmas approached, they all organized an effort to get him Christmas presents so that his father then, who was going down to the U of M hospital, would bring these Christmas presents to their classmate. And they all knew he wasn't going to make it. But that just really touched me. And that story has stuck with me, forever. There was another one in Castleton. Again, this was like 30 years ago in Castleton, North Dakota. A little boy, for his make-a-wish was to throw a Christmas party for his classmates in his elementary room. And so they had Christmas in the classroom. So I just thought that was neat. And then a couple years ago, there were a couple of Christmas stories that just really touched me. One was two kids from Grand Forks. I think they were about 4 or 5. Mm-hmm. They had Down syndrome, and they were best buds. And one, her name was Clara, was always in the hospital with medical issues. Mm-hmm. And they really missed each other. So they started FaceTiming each other, these two kids. And I was so touched by that because it was the holiday season. Mm-hmm. Clara, I wasn't sure she was going to get out even to be at home for Christmas. And so she FaceTimed her little buddy. And then another story was out of Fertile, Minnesota. There was a Vietnam vet. His name was Johnny. And he had been down to Mayo Clinic and got some bad news about a prognosis for pancreatic cancer. But he was a Vietnam vet, so the town knew he never got a welcome home when he came back from Vietnam. And as a way to thank him, when he came back, I found myself getting choked up about it. He came back from Mayo Clinic, and the town lined the street at 11 o'clock at night with signs, flags, music, and they welcomed him home. He honestly only lived another week after that welcome home. But what a welcome home that was for that little town of Fertile to say, we know you're going through a rough time. We love you, and, here's what we think of you. I was so moved by that. It was just amazing.
To finally be seen, even though he didn't have much time left.
Right.
I mean, I think there, with just all of the upheaval around the Vietnam War, and those vets were either unseen or people were hostile to them.
Yeah.
And to just have their service recognized, no matter the political climate, that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, and he was kind of a hero. Because he had lost an arm and a leg in Vietnam. And so the town thought a lot about him. And finally, the last Christmas story, I remember this. It was in Wallevand, Minnesota. This was a year ago. A little boy had lost his mom to cancer, and a family friend took him in because there was, at the time, no father in the picture. And it was Santa Day in Wallevand with the Lions Club or something. And so Santa was having kids come up, sit on the lap, tell what they want for Christmas or whatever. And this little boy who was about 5, who had just lost his mother, went up and sat in Santa's lap, and just the kid on his own just turned to Santa and just kind of hugged him and really didn't want to leave Santa. And so we did a whole story on that photo. But it was really compelling because then we told the backstory of what this kid had been through, and maybe what Christmas meant to him. But we also interviewed Santa. What was that like to have, at that moment, have a pretty important role in that kid's life, even though it was pretty brief.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was interesting.
Do you get a sixth sense about things? Can you tell if it's going to be a powerful story or a compelling story as you're interviewing someone? Do you get that sense like, wow? Or do you know that going into a story or?
No, you're right. Yeah, you're really on that. I can tell about halfway through a story if it's going to be compelling. However, sometimes it's not until you're editing and you're putting things together. Like on this COVID stuff we did last week, we interviewed a patient, and it was through Zoom, which I'm like, are the viewers going to get it, what this guy went through? It's a Zoom interview. The lighting was cruddy. It was kind of fuzzy. And it wasn't until we were editing and we heard the guy say, I thought I was going to die. And then he got very emotional, and we didn't say anything. Our voice didn't come in. We just let that sit. And a few seconds later, he said, I was more afraid of going on a vent than I was of dying. And the same thing, we just kind of let that sink in. And it was very powerful from a Zoom interview. So yeah, sometimes it's not until you're...
No, I'll back you up on that, because that moment was really uncomfortable.
Yep.
But uncomfortable in a powerful way. Like, it was sinking in, just the weight of mortality. And when he followed it up with being afraid of being on a vent, wasn't he a paramedic or
He'd been a paramedic, a nurse, a carpenter, yeah.
I mean, so he was somebody who actually knew
what happened,
the process of how to do that. And so he himself was, coming from a place of experience, but he hadn't been on the receiving end of that type of medical intervention before.
Yeah.
And so it was powerful, that moment. I think that was the most powerful moment for me too, of that segment. I also, the things that the nurse said that you interviewed, she had a lot of just how real she was.
Honest answers, right? So her saying, not every day is a good day. It's not rainbows and roses. And saying, we do as much as we can with what we have, but that it's mentally exhausting, physically exhausting, but what other choice do you have? That's when you just really respect people for what they do and for their honesty of being upfront with their story. You know what I mean?
You were kind of telling a little bit about your process. So what is your process? Like, ahead of time, we were talking about notes, and I've got a few notes here and some questions that I was prepared with.
Right.
But I also like to let the conversation just go where it goes. But what's your process of approaching an interview?
Well, I never walk in with notes unless it's something super detailed. If it's technology or something, I guess I might make a few notes. But yeah, I really want it to be like this, and I don't want to be distracted by what's my next question, and then I miss something that you just said, where maybe a follow-up is, worthwhile. So I try not to to go in with any kind of like agenda or bunch of notes, because also I don't want them to be thinking, what's his next question? Honestly, my most popular questions are, tell me about whatever. And then they tell me and I'll go, what did you think about that? So it's very conversational.
Yep.
They're very short questions, because that answer about, I thought I was going to die, came from a question, what was going through your mind? Mm-hmm. How simple is that?
Yeah.
You know, it's not a lot to it, but it got an answer that was heartfelt and crazy. But
well, and your ability to be patient and let the silence stay there.
I knew not to interrupt when I heard that answer. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's moments where you're like, Kevin, just keep your mouth shut here for a couple seconds, because that's pretty phenomenal stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, preparing for any story, it's kind of a nightmare job, to be honest, because
now we're getting to it.
Honestly, when I wake up in the morning, I have a little bit of anxiety to this day. Mm-hmm. 37 years of doing this, 5 days a week. I still have this stress of like, can I make this work today? Right? Because we have to produce a story a day. Mm-hmm. Some people think, you know, I'm going to call up Kevin and maybe he can do a story in a couple days about me because he's got nothing else going on. Well, we are cranking out a story a day. So we don't meet until about 9:15. Now, a lot of my stories I just kind of do on my own and whatever, but there are days where, I get an assignment, you know, at 9:30, and so I'm making calls by 10 o'clock, trying to set up interviews by maybe 11 or 1 o'clock, going out, doing the interviews, coming back, writing, editing. Everything has to work. Mm-hmm. You know, if I'm doing a story about theology and I want to talk to Pastor Mary, I call her at 10 o'clock. I hope she's available at 11. Well, what are the odds of that? You never know, right?
Serendipity.
So all the planets have to line up every day.
Yeah.
And that's for the 4 or 5 of us on the staff. We're all doing that, all trying to make something work every day. And, you know, because you've got 5 shows to fill every day, mm-hmm. 4, 5, 6, 9, 10. And so you're a contributor. So you better come through.
Well, you all must be adventurous and thrive on some amount of adrenaline.
Totally. Yep. That's so true. I thought of that. I just saw that, in fact, on a professional storyteller Facebook site. It's like someone commented, you know, there are days where I think, wouldn't it be nice to have a 9-to-5 job? And then the guy said, there's no way I could do it.
Yeah. Because
there's this adrenaline with, you know, trying, like that story in the COVID unit yesterday in a patient room. You know, I had to hustle and put that together in just a couple of hours. And, you know, there was a lot to it.
But it keeps things exciting. Like, you never have to worry about being bored.
No.
And also then you mentioned there's a number of you on the team.
Yeah.
So if you get the right team and you have that right element of everybody's hustling, everybody's trying to put stuff together, it must also be a great working environment too.
It is. It can, you know, when the show comes together and it's a good show or it's a good election night or what have you, it's a great feeling. It's also the type of job where, for the most part, when you leave to go home, you're done.
Wow.
You know, you're done for the day pretty much, because, you know, it's not like I should be working on this, or because your story aired, you're done until 8 hours later, and it starts all over again. The one difference is the documentary stuff that I've done.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
That's much different ball game.
Okay, so I'm imagining. So what's that process? You go somewhere, you get a lot of experiences, and then you come back and unpack them? Like, how do you...
Yeah, it's changed because of technology. So back in the day, some of my first series documentaries were a series in Peru on a medical team, cleft lip medical team. The quilt, which we did in Africa, we followed a Lutheran church quilt all the way to civil war in Angola, Africa, which is a crazy backstory because WDY thought, well, first of all, they said no like 5 times to go on this Africa journey. And they thought that it was this cute little story, we're going to follow a quilt, right? Well, they had no idea. They wouldn't have allowed it, first of all, because we were literally in the middle of a civil war in Angola. And we were on a United Nations plane that, to avoid gunfire, dropped quickly down into this refugee camp where we got out. And there's our quilt from Buffalo Lutheran, north of Moorhead. And I just laugh at it because if DEY had known at the time what we were getting into, I mean, there were landmines everywhere. So yeah, it was crazy.
How was that whole experience for you?
That was pivotal because, I'd been to a couple, I guess I'd been to Peru. I hadn't been to Haiti yet or any of these other places, but, here I am, small town Minnesota kid, and I'm in a refugee camp, right? So you're thinking back to what you heard about as a little kid, that there's poor people, and I'm living it. I'm watching it unfold. These people walking around with their legs have been blown off in landmines. They were starving to death. And I'm like, this is what? This is happening in our world? And then I go on to find, after going on some of these other trips, wow, this is like a big chunk of our world.
But I think this is where the power of you being a local person that people have come to know and trust, then when you go out to a different part of the world and you bring this story back with you, people trust you, so you're kind of that connecting point between us and the rest of the world. And so I think it's so powerful then for us to hear you tell us and to show us this is what's happening, because it helps us then understand there's something bigger than just what we experience in the Fargo-Moorhead area.
That's the hope. Yeah.
And hopefully it makes us feel empathetic.
Exactly. It did me, right? Going to these places. I mean, we did another documentary in Haiti, and the first time I went there, I was just so struck by the poverty, and the people had nothing, right? They're in a grass hut, and if they maybe had a couple of balls of rice for the week, they felt fortunate. And so yeah, I think I've been back 22 times to Haiti with our surgical team from Fargo, just doing this little surgical week, and it's just a part of me now, where it's not like, oh, we feel we need to do something, because I just don't buy that the U.S. people are here to save us. That doesn't happen. Yeah, but if you can go do your thing for a few days, help some people out, and get back home, that's good.
Well, and hopefully by you telling the story, it can create that empathy and compassion. But then a next step would be then impact my actions of what's one way either I could get involved to care for people in that story, or else, like, how could I get involved in caring for my neighbor down the street?
Totally. That has happened, which that thrills me when I hear that. So a family sits down and watches that, and that sparks them to do something in their community or their neighborhood or whatever. And yeah, that's heartwarming to see. But our community is that way kind of anyway. I'm always amazed at action. You know what I mean? Faith in action in this town is off the charts, right? And they're not doing it to be do-gooders. It's like, no, it's what we do.
But I think it's part of our spiritual health, because it is easy to get turned into yourself. And we all are going through different things, and it's easy to get caught up in our own stuff.
Right.
But when you actually get involved and take action on behalf of someone else or do something with or for someone else, you're getting out of your own stuff for a moment. I mean, I think that's actually healthy spiritually.
It's funny you say that. I got a call 2 days ago, and it was just random, and the guy's like, hey, I might have a story for you. He goes, we have a carpenter that works for our company. He's the greatest guy. He'd do anything for you, but he doesn't have any teeth. And all of us in the office are raising money, and we're going to buy him teeth. And I know that sounds like a weird story.
Oh, it sounds awesome.
I think that's so touching in a weird kind of way. But I mean, that's, you know what? That says a lot about, this is what I mean, about people in our town that'll like step up to do something like that.
But isn't that the best embodiment of service? Like how you said, we don't want to be we're the Americans, we're coming here to help you. But I think the best way to actually serve is, okay, who are your neighbors? What are the actual needs? How are we connected? Like understanding the bigger picture.
Right.
And then when you understand what someone's needs are, and if you have some ability to help, I mean, it creates a partnership because you're actually meeting something that is there. So that guy has a tangible need for teeth.
Right. Yep.
And people could see that because they know him and they're doing something that impacts him directly, not just something they think he'd like.
Exactly. Yeah. I kind of like the thought, live out the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And don't just be a Christian, but act like a Christian. And these are really little things that people are doing, but they're big things. They're changing.
But isn't that what Jesus actually did? Like, he wasn't just, it was mostly stories he would tell. He would do things and tell stories while doing them.
Right.
Rather than just telling people to do stuff.
Right. But think of the things he was teaching then that we're still trying to implement today. Some of us fail miserably, but he's telling us to treat people well. Mm-hmm. All right, let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think the stories you tell help us to keep that part of our heart open, because we've heard, we've had COVID fatigue.
Right.
People are sick of being vigilant. They're sick of having to wear masks out there. They're sick of just how long this is. And I think it's easy to not care.
And I've thought about that even with my COVID stories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, are people tired of seeing people walking around in PPE at clinics and hospitals, and we're trying to tell stories? But I don't think so. But yeah, that's crossed my mind if people are tired of hearing and watching it.
But part of your responsibility as a journalist is to tell the story that's out there.
Right.
And it's still out there. So even if it makes us uncomfortable, it's something we need to hear in order to be an informed citizen, but also just to keep on caring about what's happening to our neighbors.
Well, and think of this, how many months we've been in the middle of this.
Mm-hmm.
And with even pastors and sermons on this subject, like how far do you go, or what do you preach? How do you make people feel optimistic in times of this? You know what I mean?
I've found it's been really exciting because as hard as it's been, the longer we go through it, I keep learning more.
Yeah.
There's things I wouldn't have learned even last month or some months earlier than that. Because we've been in this long enough that we've actually adopted some new ways of being.
Right.
Like how you talked about the story of those two little girls FaceTiming each other. Like, we've had FaceTime for a long time, but how many of us have actually utilized it as much as we've been using it now? And I'm not saying FaceTime should replace face-to-face interaction, but yet it's one tool. And if we can focus on what can we do rather than focus on the limitations, I think that's a way to keep us sustained. And so as a church, we've been ourselves trying to be trained to how can we reach out, not focusing on the avenues that are closed to us right now, but on the avenues that are still open, things that may have been there all along and we just haven't utilized them as fully, like phone calls. Right. Phones have been around for a long time, even before they were cell phones.
Yeah.
And our calling ministry. Mm-hmm.
People are adjusting, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time for us to be creative and just keep, well, how can we reach out? And I think when we keep our focus on that, I think it does bring the hope. It does bring like, okay, Jesus is still here. Jesus has been a part of our world in many generations and eras through previous plagues and difficult times. And people have seen Jesus. People have experienced this power of God's presence. And so this is another one of those times.
You know, when I was up on the COVID unit last week, that struck me because I thought, what are these families going through? Because there was a Lutheran minister from town who's a chaplain that I saw her walk into a room with an iPad, and she was getting ready to allow the family to get on FaceTime to say goodbye to a loved one who was passing away from COVID. And I just thought of what it must be like for these pastors, for these nurses, who that's now become kind of part of their job. I thought it was sad when I heard they now have iPads at every nurse's station for this reason.
Yeah.
But boy, what a moment for these people to be able to allow these families to say their goodbyes this way, at least, where some of them can, see their loved one or not, because I guess that's something too. Some of them choose not to.
Yeah, and there's just no way around how hard that is.
No, on what they're going through, because they can't be there, And
yet, I was so thankful for that chaplain to step in that role and to still, that's part of what we're trained for as pastors or chaplains, is to be there at those hard times. And I saw her walking in and being there in a new way that was new to her, but yet she was doing it and responding to her call. And I just felt like, thank you. I was just so thankful for her and thankful for all the people that are doing that. The doctors and nurses, because it's not just pastors and chaplains.
Exactly.
These nurses, respiratory therapists, everybody on the care team are stepping up and finding ways to care. And so in the midst of the hardness, I'm just so grateful.
I always think when I saw all that FaceTime stuff going on, it's like, we're really going to need a break from all this when it's done, because I think of what these families are going to continue to struggle with after not being able to be there with dad or grandpa, because they weren't allowed in there. Stuff in the nursing home, same, restrictions and all that. It's just all this stuff that we're packing up right now. It's like, how are we all going to deal with that, months from now? The whole thing about regrets, shoulda, coulda, woulda stuff. So I think
you're lifting up one more way that we can be the kinds of neighbors that Jesus has called us to be. Because I think helping one another unpack that. Because I think as we look back at what we have been through and we see the pictures of ourselves with masks, or I think it'll be important for all of us to help each other tell those stories. Because I think there's a way to engage it well, rather than just say, well, that was a terrible chapter, let's just close the door. I think there's so much to be learned right now, and I hope we help each other learn it in the future.
I'm always interested to, because when the pandemic started, I remember going to the Clay County Museum, and we looked back at how did this community handle the first pandemic? And it was really interesting. Our churches opened up and had patients in there because, think about it, the treatments were pretty limited. No ventilators to speak of. So churches became places where patients went. I think even some schools. They had masks then. So it'd be interesting to know 100 years from now, how are they going to look back on how we handled it? Because technology would be way different then. And
And there still are so many, not everything needs the technology. Technology is just the tool.
Right.
But our church has opened up for childcare needs with the school districts to space kids out more. We host the once a month pop-up Ruby's Food Pantry.
Right.
Your church does the hot meals.
Yep.
I mean, these are tangible things that people are needing right now to help families and deal with people who are hungry.
So that's what comes back to the, being empathetic, and that is knowing all these families in town. I mean, we're all in the same boat on this. But, if you start thinking of the families that have lost businesses, lost their jobs, trying to teach their kids at home, man, that is a lot on some people's plate. And to be able to step up and as a church community to do a small part, that's great.
And when we see these stories of what people are going through, I think it helps us always remember that we're not fighting each other. We're trying to deal with a virus. Like, this virus just is doing what it does. And so that's the thing that we need to be focused on. How can we mitigate this, not fight against each other? Certain businesses are struggling, others are booming, but how can we not pit people against each other, but to say, hey, we're all fighting something that's against all of us, really.
Yeah, it really made me sad early on in the pandemic when I, saw some of this, the verbal attacks. Social media certainly didn't help, but hopefully that's kind of calmed down a little bit.
Well, which brings me to my final question. What is giving you hope right now?
You know what? Everyone around me. So when I get to go out and do stories like the people buying the guy teeth, that makes me feel good. Because as a news reporter, you do a lot of stories that, they hurt, right? You can tell when a community is hurting. Yeah. If Southeast North Dakota, there's a young man who was in an accident a few days ago. They had a big church vigil the other night. That community is hurting, because they're not sure what the outcome of this accident will be for that young man. But yeah, when you see communities like that turn out for a family, when you see what's going on here in town with different programs for families, that's hopeful. That's when you're in the right place. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for being here
Thanks,
today.
Mary. That was fun.
I think our marching orders going from this conversation are to find ways to care for one another. And I have been inspired to just think about the ways I speak to my neighbors and friends and people here in the church, of asking the question, so tell me about, because that's what I learned from, tell me about, and then how was that for you?
Right.
I mean, we don't have to be professional journalists to ask one another these questions, and to be willing to listen, to be willing to hear what our neighbor or our friend is going through, a family member right now. So thanks for teaching us how to care for one another by being interested in caring for each other.
Well, thank you. That's fun.
And join us next month for our next Leading the Conversation.